something has been stolen from your pocket. But more importantly, something has been stolen from your very soul. And the worst part, most believers who walk into a church every Sunday morning have no idea they are participating in a calculated, systematic replacement. This is not a financial seminar. This isn't the typical giving appeal you've heard 1,000 times from the pulpit. This is a warning about an ancient covenant that has been erased and replaced by a human tradition, a tradition that wears the mask of piety but is completely void of spiritual power. You feel it, don't you? You write the check, you drop the cash into the offering plate, but the heavens above you remain as silent as cold copper. You've been told that if you give, God will open the windows of heaven. Yet all you receive in return is the suffocating weight of debt and a strange, growing distance from your Creator. That is because the tithing system you are practicing has been hollowed out into a mere financial transaction. While its original form was a spiritual key designed to unlock the dimensions of the kingdom. Stop and reflect for a moment. Why? In this world of total instability, where the very foundations of society are shaking, is the modern church more focused on the numbers in your bank account than the vibration of your soul? The truth is, tithing was never about money. God, the owner of the universe and every resource within it, does not need the paper bills in your wallet. He does not require your contribution to keep his kingdom running. So, what exactly has been hidden behind those verses about storehouses and blessings? To find out, we must go further back than the law of Moses, further back than the nation of Israel. We must return to the moment Abraham encountered a mysterious figure who had no beginning and no end, Melchizedek. Why did Abraham give a tenth of his spoils to a king priest who belonged to no earthly lineage? It wasn't a legal requirement. The law didn't even exist yet. It was a covenant of honor and connection. Abraham didn't give to get blessed. He gave to acknowledge that he had entered a different realm, a realm where provision does not come from this world. But look at what the modern institution has done. They have taken a sacred, voluntary covenant and turned it into a religious tax. They use the fear of a curse to bind your conscience. They have taken Malachi 3 and turned it into a whip to lash the backs of the struggling, all while ignoring that the original warning was meant for the greedy priests who were embezzling God's glory. Listen closely. As the sky turns red and the signs of the end are etched upon the moon, God is trying to get your attention. He is not looking for your wallet. He is looking for your readiness to step out of the fog of human tradition. The window of grace is still open, but it is not opened by money. It is opened by the blood covenant that the world has tried to make you forget. Tonight, the first secret begins to unravel. You will see why tithing is directly linked to your protection in the dark days ahead, and why most lukewarm believers will be left behind because they valued their finances more than the covenant. Are you ready to face the harsh reality of what has happened to your faith? The question isn't how much you've given. The question is, do you truly belong to the covenant? To understand the magnitude of the lie you've been told, we must look at a fact so simple, yet so profound, that it threatens the very foundation of modern church accounting. Look closely at your Bible from Genesis to Malachi. Search every verse, every command, and every historical record. You will find something shocking. In the thousands of years of biblical history, the tithe was never, not even once, defined as money. Wait, let that sink in. Most of you have been conditioned to believe that tithing is the act of giving 10% of your income or your wages in the form of currency. But in the ancient world, currency existed. Gold, silver, and coins were used for taxes, for land purchases, and for trade. Yet, when God spoke about the tithe, He didn't ask for the shekel. He asked for the seed. He asked for the fruit. He asked for the life. Why does this matter? Because money is a human invention of value storage. But food is a direct manifestation of God's life force. When the modern institution demands your cash, they are shifting the focus from a miracle of growth to a transaction of labor. They have turned a celebration of God's seasonal provision into a cold monthly subscription fee. Go back to the Torah. In Leviticus 27, God is explicit. The tithe is of the land, the seed of the land, and the fruit of the tree. It is holy to the Lord. It was edible. It was meant to be eaten in a sacred feast. It was about sustenance and communion, not administration and salaries. The storehouse mentioned in Malachi wasn't a bank account. It was a literal granary intended to feed the Levite, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. When you give money today and call it a biblical tithe, you are participating in a linguistic sleight of hand. You are being told that your electronic transfer is the equivalent of the first fruits of the earth. But there is a massive spiritual disconnect here. Money represents your toil, the sweat of your brow under the curse of Adam. But the biblical tithe represented the grace of the earth, the portion that God grew while you were sleeping. By demanding money, the modern church has inadvertently, or perhaps intentionally, disconnected you from the cycle of divine dependency. They've made it about your budgeting skills rather than your covenantal alignment. And here is the mystery that few dare to mention. When Abraham met Melchizedek, the king of righteousness, Melchizedek didn't come with a ledger or a collection basket. He came with bread and wine, the elements of life, the elements that Jesus would later hold up at the Last Supper. Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils, the tangible evidence of a victory God had already won. It was a response to a spiritual reality, not a requirement to keep the lights on in a building. The institutional church has flipped the script. They've made the tithe a prerequisite for God's hand to move, when in reality, the tithe was a celebration that God had already moved. By turning it into a currency-based obligation, they have locked you into a works-based mindset. You give because you're afraid of the devourer, instead of giving because you are in awe of the provider. Tonight, we pull back the veil further. We are going to examine the exact moment in history when the food became finance, and why this shift was the ultimate trap to keep you in a state of spiritual lukewarmness. If the tithe isn't money, then what is the redemption of the soul truly worth? The answer is far more costly than 10% of your paycheck and far more liberating than you can imagine. As the shadows of the Great Tribulation begin to lengthen over the earth, you must ask yourself, is your financial loyalty protecting you? Or is it merely funding a system that has forgotten the name of the one it claims to serve? If you have spent any time in a modern church, you have heard the thunderous recitation of Malachi 3:10. It is the golden verse of the collection plate. Bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. You've been told that the storehouse is the local church building, the house is the sanctuary, and the tithes are your monthly paychecks. But tonight, we strip away the layers of institutional manipulation to reveal a truth that the modern religious machine cannot afford for you to know. First, look at the audience. To whom was Malachi speaking? He wasn't speaking to the struggling widow in the pew or the hard-working father trying to pay his bills. He was addressing the corrupt priests. He was rebuking the religious leaders who were stealing the best portions for themselves and offering the blind and the lame to God. The Malachi 3 warning is not a threat to the people. It is an indictment of the leadership. Now, look at the purpose of the storehouse. God says, that there may be food in my house, not funds, not capital for the building project, not salary for the staff. The storehouse was a literal, physical granary. Why? Because the tithe was God's ancient welfare system. It was designed to feed the Levites, who had no land of their own, but also, and this is the part the modern church conveniently forgets, it was to feed the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. In the biblical covenant, the tithe was a mechanism of radical mercy. It ensured so that in the community of God, no one went hungry. When a modern church takes 10% of a struggling family's income to pay for a laser light show or a plush carpet, while that same family cannot afford groceries, they are not fulfilling Malachi. They committing the very sin that Malachi was sent to condemn. They are robbing the poor to decorate the temple. And what about the windows of heaven? You've been promised a 100-fold financial return if you give. You've been told that God will pour out a blessing you cannot contain, usually interpreted as a bigger house or a promotion. But in the Hebrew context, what comes through the windows of heaven rain. In an agricultural society, rain was the difference between life and death. The windows of heaven represented the agricultural blessing of the earth. When God promised to rebuke the devourer, He wasn't talking about a demon of debt attacking your car's transmission. He was talking about locusts and pests that ate the grain. It was a promise of environmental and biological protection for a people who lived in total dependency on the soil. By turning this into a financial investment strategy, the modern church has turned God into a divine ATM. They have replaced the awe-inspiring mystery of divine provision with a transactional pay-to-play scheme. They have locked the windows of heaven and told you that the only key is your credit card. As the world's financial systems begin to fracture, and as we approach the great shaking, you must realize that a financial tithe to a corrupt system will not save you. The real storehouse of the end times is not a building. It is a covenant community built on the original blueprint of mercy. God is looking for those who will bring food, the spiritual and physical life of Christ, back into His house. The question is no longer, are you giving? The question is your giving feeding the widow, or is it feeding the machine? The answer to that question will determine whether you're standing under an open heaven or a ceiling of brass. Have you ever wondered why? In all the letters written to the early churches, letters dealing with every sin, every doctrine, and every practical struggle, the Apostle Paul never once mentions the 10% tithe. Think about the magnitude of that silence. Paul traveled thousands of miles, established dozens of communities, and spent years teaching the whole counsel of God. Yet, when it came to supporting the ministry, he spoke of cheerful giving, generosity, and equality. But he never issued a 10% invoice. Why? Because Paul knew that the Levitical levy had expired the moment the veil in the temple was torn in two. The tithe was a shadow. The reality is Christ. But the modern institution has performed a spiritual resurrection of a dead law, because a dead law is more profitable than a living spirit. Look at the book of Acts. You see a community where no one claimed that any of their possessions was their own. They didn't give 10%, they surrendered everything to the lordship of Jesus. This wasn't a tax, it was a family covenant. They shared meals, they sold land, and they ensured that the poor among them were cared for. They weren't funding a building fund, they were funding a movement of mercy. When the modern church uses the curse of Malachi to threaten you into giving, they are committing a theological crime. Galatians 3:13 is clear. Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law. You cannot be cursed for not tithing if you are in Christ, because Christ has already fulfilled the law's requirements. To tell a believer they are robbing God and under a curse is to trample on the blood of Jesus. It is to say that His sacrifice wasn't enough to secure your blessing, and that you must buy your way back into God's favor with a 10% down payment. The early church operated on the Melchizedek priesthood, which is based on the power of an indestructible life, not a legal requirement. In this higher priesthood, giving is a response to victory, not a bribe for protection. Abraham gave to Melchizedek after the battle was won, not to convince God to help him fight. As we drift deeper into the shadows of the end times, the religious system is becoming more desperate. They see the lukewarm leaving the pews, and they are doubling down on the law to keep the coffers full. But God is calling you to a higher standard. He is moving you away from giving to get and into the covenant of provision. If you are giving out of fear, your gift is dead. If you are giving to avoid a curse, you are still a slave. The true tithe was a shadow of a life totally yielded to the Master. In the coming days of the great shaking, your financial obedience to a human institution will not shield you. Only your covenant alignment with the King of Kings will provide the hidden manna when the world's storehouses go empty. The question for you tonight is, are you following the rules of the Pharisees or the heart of the apostles? One leads to a ledger of debt. The other leads to the freedom of the Spirit. If you want to see a religious leader break into a cold sweat, ask them to explain Deuteronomy chapter 14. It is the chapter that the modern financial machine desperately wishes was not in your Bible. Because in this ancient text, the prophetic blueprint of tithing reveals a secret that completely destroys the pay-to-play narrative. God says to his people, "You shall truly tithe all the increase of your grain, and you shall eat before the Lord your God in the place where he chooses." Read that again. God did not say, "Bring the tithe so the priest can decide what to do with it." He said, "You shall eat it." The tithe was a mandatory celebration of joy. It was a spiritual feast designed to remind the believer that the earth belongs to the King, and the King is a generous host. But it gets even more radical. God continues in verses 25 and 26, saying that if the journey is too far for you to carry your grain and cattle, you should sell them for silver. And then, did he say, give the silver to the building fund? No. He said, spend that money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen or sheep, for wine or similar drink. You shall eat there before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your household. Let that truth explode the religious programming in your mind. God commanded his people to use the tithe to buy wine and strong drink and to feast in his presence. The tithe was never a bill to be paid. It was a party of the covenant. It was the moment where the lukewarm were set on fire by the goodness of God. It was the moment where the community looked at their abundance and said, "Look what our Father has grown for us." Now, ask yourself, why have you never heard a sermon on the party tithe? Why has the modern church replaced a feast of freedom with a fast of fear? The answer is control. You cannot control a person who is feasting in the joy of the Lord. You cannot manipulate someone who understands that God's primary desire for the tithe was for the family to be fed and for the heart to be glad by stealing the feast from you. The religious institution has stolen your spiritual morale. They have turned the joyful worship of the Creator into a somber obligation to the corporation. In the dark days that are approaching, as the signs in the sun and moon intensify, the enemy wants you spiritually malnourished. He wants you focused on the lack in your bank account rather than the fullness of the Father's table. The modern church has taken the bread of life and traded it for a balance sheet. Tonight, the veil is torn a bit further. You are beginning to see that the tithing you've been taught is a ghost, a hollowed-out shell of a vibrant, living, edible covenant. As we move closer to the climax of this revelation, we will see the dark origins of how the church transitioned from the joy of the feast to the bondage of the tithe law. The Master is knocking at the door. He isn't asking for your money. He is saying, "If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and dine with him." The invitation is to a supper, not a surcharge. Are you ready to sit at the real table? Why does the modern church feel so uncomfortable with the word blood when it comes to the tithe? Why have they worked so hard to sanitize, deodorize, and digitize an act that was originally meant to be raw and visceral? The answer lies in the genetic memory of provision. You see, for thousands of years, the people of God understood that you cannot sustain life without the exchange of life. When they brought a tithe of their flocks, there was a physical cost. There was the warmth of the animal, the smell of the earth, and the undeniable reality of a life being dedicated to the Creator. But the modern institution has performed a spiritual lobotomy on the believer. They have taken the life force out of your sacrifice and replaced it with digits. They have made it easy for you to give so that you don't have to feel the weight of the covenant. Think about this. In the original blueprint, the tithe was connected to the bloodline. It was about the continuation of the family, the preservation of the seed, and the protection of the lineage. When the blood of the Passover lamb was applied to the doorframe, it was a tithe of life to protect the life within. It was a visible sign that this household belonged to a higher jurisdiction. When you digitize your tithe into a mere financial transaction, you're stripping away the spiritual DNA of the act. Money has no soul. Money carries no genetic memory. Money is a dead medium. By demanding currency instead of life-giving increase, the church has disconnected your family from the primal protection of the covenant. They have told you that a 10% transfer is enough to keep you safe, while they ignore the fact that your children are spiritually wandering and your household is under constant psychological siege. The lukewarm church loves the digital tithe because it requires no heartbeat. It requires no proximity to the altar. It allows you to stay clean and professional while you fulfill your religious quota. But as the sky turns dark and the blood moon rises, a professional religion will not save you. A digitized faith will provide no shelter when the great shaking begins. God is calling for a return to the visceral covenant. He is looking for those who understand that giving is a life-for-life exchange. It's not about the dollar amount. It's about the surrender of the source. When you give, are you merely paying a bill, or are you reapplying the blood to the doorframe of your life? Are you recognizing that every breath you take is a gift from the Master? Or are you trying to buy a fire insurance policy with your spare change? The modern church has stolen the awe of the sacrifice and replaced it with the efficiency of the donation. They have sanitized the sanctuary so thoroughly that you can no longer smell the presence of the living God, only the scent of fresh carpet and expensive coffee. Tonight, the warning becomes personal. If your faith is only as deep as your bank statement, you're standing on sand. The ancient prophets didn't die for a financial system. They died for a blood covenant. In the coming days, the storehouses of paper will burn, but the storehouse of the Spirit will overflow for those who know the difference. The question is, when the digits disappear, what will be left of your connection to the King, who moved the ancient boundary stones for 300 years after the resurrection of the Lamb. The followers of the Way lived in a radical, voluntary economy of love. They didn't need a 10% law because they were possessed by 100% of the Spirit. But then, the unthinkable happened. The church, once a persecuted minority hiding in catacombs, moved into the palaces of Rome. And when the church sat on a throne, it suddenly developed a very earthly appetite for gold. Tonight, we uncover the council of captivity. History records that for centuries, the early church fathers, men like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, explicitly rejected the idea of a mandatory tithe, calling it a Jewish shadow that had passed away. But as the Dark Ages began to settle over the earth, the institutional machine realized it could not fund its cathedrals and its crusades through voluntary love alone. It was in the Council of Macon, in 585 AD, that the trap was finally set. The religious leaders of that age issued a decree. The tithe was no longer a celebration. It was now a legal mandate. They took the sword of the state and handed it to the priest. If you didn't pay your 10%, you weren't just robbing God, you were a criminal against the church, subject to excommunication and the loss of your eternal soul. This was the birth of the religious tax. This was the moment the feast was officially buried and the invoice was born. They took the beautiful edible covenant of Deuteronomy and turned it into a cold, transactional requirement to keep the institution alive. They replaced the Holy Spirit with holy enforcement. Why does this matter to you sitting in a modern pew? Because the DNA of your tithing sermon today was not written by the apostles in Jerusalem. It was written by medieval power brokers in Europe who were desperate for control. When your pastor tells you that you owe 10%, he is unknowingly quoting a 6th century political decree, not the 1st century gospel of grace. The modern church has inherited a system of spiritual serfdom. They have told you that you are a son, but they treat you like a tenant. They have made God out to be a landlord who will evict you from his blessing if the rent isn't paid by the 1st of the month. But listen closely, as the signs on the earth multiply and the blood moon heralds the return of the true king. The medieval walls are beginning to crumble. God is dismantling the council of captivity. He is calling his people back to the original freedom of the way, a freedom where we give not because we are taxed, but because we are transformed. The religious machine is terrified of this revelation. If you realize that the 10% law was a historical invention to fund an empire, you will stop being a consumer of religion and start being a carrier of the kingdom. The machine needs your digits. The king needs your heart. One is about survival. The other is about sovereignty. The question is, whose law are you under? The law of a medieval council, or the law of the indestructible life? The time for playing church is over. The great shaking will leave nothing but the truth. Have you heard the seed faith promise? You've been told that if you plant a seed of $1,000, God is legally obligated to return a harvest of 10,000. You've been told that your tithe is a down payment on a miracle. But tonight, under the shadow of a darkening world, We must ask the question that the religious elite are terrified of. When did the King of Glory become a divine stock market? The modern church has taken the 6th century tax and given it a 21st century marketing makeover. They have replaced the cross with a contract. They tell you that the devourer is lurking at your door, ready to take your health, your children, and your peace, and that the only way to bribe God into protecting you is through your 10%. This is not faith. This is spiritual blackmail by turning the tithe into a transaction. The institution has created a generation of lukewarm investors rather than fire-filled disciples. You give because you want a return, not because you love the giver. You treat the Almighty like a cosmic vending machine. Insert the coin, pull the lever, and wait for the blessing. But look around you. The world is shaking. The signs in the sun, moon, and stars are screaming that the time of human systems is ending. Do you truly believe that a seed offering to a private jet ministry will provide a shield when the Great Tribulation begins? The prosperity gospel is the ultimate distraction. It keeps your eyes fixed on your bank balance while the kingdom balance is being weighed. It tells you that gain is godliness, a philosophy that the Apostle Paul specifically warned would characterize the perilous times of the last days. Here is the secret they won't tell you. The 10% has become a shield for the flesh. Many believers use their tithe as a way to buy off God so they don't have to give Him their lives. They think, I gave my 10%, now the rest of my time, my heart, and my habits belong to me. They use the tithe to keep God at a distance. They pay the tax so the king won't ask for the throne of their heart. But as the blood moon rises, the king is not looking for your receipts. He is looking for your oil. Like the 5 wise virgins, the oil of the Spirit cannot be bought or traded. It only comes through a life that is 100% surrendered, a life that understands that tithing was never about the money. It was about the total ownership of the Master. The modern church has made you feel safe because you are compliant with their financial rules. But there is a massive difference between being religious and being covered. One is based on your performance. The other is based on His provision. In the coming days, the storehouses of paper will fail. The seed faith promises will go silent. Only those who have entered the true Melchizedek covenant, the one based on an indestructible life, succeed. The question for you tonight is your giving a bribe for protection? Or is it a surrender of your source? One is a trap. The other is a gateway. The clock is striking midnight for the institutional church. The systems of men are being weighed in the balances and found wanting. But in the midst of this darkness, a new sound is rising, not the sound of coins falling into a plate, but the sound of a royal priesthood waking up. To understand your true purpose in these final hours, you must understand the order of Melchizedek. The modern church has kept you trapped in the order of Levi, a system of laws, levies, and limitations. But the book of Hebrews tells us that Jesus did not come as a Levitical priest. He came after the order of Melchizedek. What is the difference? The Levitical tithe was a commandment to take. The Melchizedek tithe was a response to being. When Abraham gave to Melchizedek, he wasn't fulfilling a religious quota. He was recognizing a high-dimensional reality. He was acknowledging that his victory didn't come from his 318 trained servants. It came from the possessor of heaven and earth. This was the remnant's rebellion, a refusal to take the spoils of the king of Sodom, and a total reliance on the king of righteousness. Tonight, I am telling you that tithing was always meant to be your act of war against the system of the world. It was never about funding a building. It was about honoring the source in the face of the enemy. But the modern institution has domesticated this act of war into a boring, monthly administrative task. They have taken the indestructible life out of the equation and replaced it with operating expenses. As we approach the great shaking, the Melchizedek remnant is being called to rebel against the religious machine. They are realizing that true tithing is the consecration of the harvest. It is the recognition that every resource in your hands is a kingdom asset to be deployed for the end times harvest. God is not asking for 10% of your money so He can bless the other 90%. He is asking for 100% of your allegiance so He can authorize 100% of your resources. The lukewarm will continue to pay their religious tax to a dying system, hoping for a blessing that will never come. But the awakened will bring their first fruits to the feet of the true Melchizedek, Jesus Christ. They will stop funding entertainment centers and start funding refugees of truth in the coming days. When the mark is introduced and the global market is locked, your financial compliance with a corrupt church will provide you zero spiritual protection. Only those who have entered the higher priesthood, who have learned to dine with Melchizedek on bread and wine, will have the hidden manna to survive the famine. The master is separating the sheep from the goats, and the collection plate is the dividing line. On one side are those who give to a system of law. On the other are those who surrender to a king of grace. The question is, are you a taxpayer in a dead religion? Or are you a priest in an eternal kingdom? The final blood moon is almost here. The sky is speaking. Are you listening? The hour is later than you think. While the world debates interest rates and the church calculates its quarterly growth, the heavens are shouting a different story. The windows of heaven are not waiting for your bank transfer. They are waiting for your awakening. We are standing at the end of the age of shadows, and the Master is preparing to close the door. You must understand the final secret. The 10% was always a schoolmaster. It was a training wheel designed to teach a stubborn humanity that they do not own what they hold. But the training era is over. In the new covenant, under the order of Melchizedek, God is not looking for a portion of your life. He is claiming the whole. The modern institution has made you comfortable with partial obedience. They told you that if you gave your 10%, you could keep the 90% for your own desires, your own idols, and your own safety. They sold you a safety zone that does not exist. But as the great shaking intensifies, as the blood moon marks the boundary between grace and judgment. The 90% you try to keep will become your greatest burden. Everything not built on the rock will be swept away. Tonight, the transactional trap is shattered. You no longer give to get a blessing. You give because you are blessed with the life of Christ. You no longer give to avoid a curse. You give because the curse has been broken by the Lamb. The true tithe is not a check. It is a surrendered life. It is the moment you look at the King and say, Master, the house, the car, the grain, and the very breath in my lungs, it all belongs to you. Use it for the harvest. This is the remnant's rebellion. It is the refusal to be a customer of a religious corporation and the decision to be a son or daughter of the living God. The institutional storehouses are failing, but the storehouse of the Spirit is overflowing with hidden manna. For those who have ears to hear, look up, the sky is turning red. The King who sat with Abraham, the high priest who broke bread in the upper room, is knocking at the door of your heart. He isn't asking for your tithe. He is asking for your allegiance. He is the final lamb. He is the true Melchizedek, and he is offering you a seat at a table that will never go empty. Even when the world's markets turn to ash, the window of grace is still open, but it is narrowing. Do not let another blood moon pass while you are still playing the game of religious compliance. Step through the door. Reapply the blood to your life. Enter the covenant that was written before the foundations of the world. The question is no longer, how much should I give? The final question is, who owns you? If the King owns you, you have everything. If the world owns you, you have nothing. Choose this night whom you will serve. The Seder is almost finished. The fourth cup is being raised. Will you be there to drink it with him? The choice is yours. The truth has been told. The veil is gone.